Heinrich Müller was born on April 28, 1900 in Munich in the heart of Bavaria, into a Catholic family connected to public order. His father worked as a rural police officer. He grew up in a Germany that still presented itself as an empire, but which was already experiencing social and political tensions that, with the war, eventually broke everything apart. In that world, advancement was not built with speeches, but with trades, discipline, and obedience. Before the outbreak of the First World War, Müller completed an apprenticeship as an aircraft mechanic. This seemingly minor detail defined the way he viewed work from the beginning. Machines, procedures, lists, inspections, parts that had to fit without room for improvisation. When the conflict dragged on and Germany entered its final phase, he already had technical training that placed him close to military aviation. In 1917, he joined the Bavarian army and served in the Luftstreitkräfte as a pilot in an observation unit for artillery, a role dangerous by definition, flying to observe the front, adjust fire, and return with useful information while machine guns and artillery turned the sky into a deadly corridor. During this period, he received decorations for bravery, recognition that did not make him famous but did give him a first mark. In state records, Müller was already listed as someone reliable under pressure. When Germany capitulated in November 1918, the country plunged into a violent transition. The defeat brought not only hunger and humiliation, but also a power vacuum. Bavaria became one of the epicenters of this chaos. Munich experienced uprisings, armed clashes in the streets, and a brief revolutionary experiment, the Bavarian Soviet Republic. In this context, Müller returned to a city where the state defended itself as best it could and where politics was resolved with gunfire. In 1919, he joined the Bavarian police as an auxiliary worker and became involved in suppressing communist uprisings in the early post-war years. Some biographies indicate that he witnessed episodes of extreme violence, such as the execution of hostages during the revolutionary period, and that this experience consolidated a lasting hatred of communism. This fixation did not arise as a theory. It was born from a city that had become a battlefield and from a state that could only survive by quickly identifying enemies and neutralizing them before they could organize. From the 1920s onward, Müller advanced within the political police. His daily work focused on monitoring groups, infiltrating networks, interrogating suspects, and turning conversations into reports. It was there that his most characteristic trait began to form, a way of writing and archiving that eliminated the personal. His reports concentrated on facts, schedules, names, connections, addresses, an office language that turned politics into files. He did not need ideological fervor to pursue someone. It was enough that the person was categorized as a threat by his superiors. In Weimar, Bavaria, this branch of the police functioned as a permanent surveillance chamber, especially against left-wing organizations. Müller specialized in methodical tracking, cards, document cross-checks, information control, and a particular capacity to maintain long chains of data without losing detail. This administrative obsession was a weapon. While other policemen got lost in rumors, he reduced disorder to systems and systems to results. During those same years, the Munich police closely monitored the growth of the Nazi Party and the climate of political violence. The failed coup of November 1923, the beer hall putsch, shook the city and put state forces on emergency mode. Müller did not appear as a public protagonist of this event, but his department experienced the direct consequence: arrests, interrogations, reports, and data collection on the actors who attempted to seize power. At this stage, his profile remained professional, obsessed with control, distant from propaganda. The decisive moment came in 1933. In March, during the Nazi coup that toppled the Bavarian government, Müller advised his superiors to use force against the Nazis. The fact was almost ironic. This stance, far from destroying him, ended up helping him. It marked him as an opponent of the movement, which made him dependent on a protector within the new order. That protector was Reinhard Heydrich, who valued his efficiency as a policeman and understood that, in a state becoming a dictatorship, a competent bureaucrat could be more useful than an incompetent fanatic. With Nazi power already established, the political police transformed. The Gestapo consolidated as a central instrument of persecution, and the Reich security system began to absorb regional cadres. For a regime seeking to crush communists, social democrats, and internal enemies, Müller was a functional piece. He knew networks, interrogation methods, and above all, knew how to manage massive archives. The US Holocaust Museum described the Gestapo as the political police force that, during the Nazi era, expanded and remained consistently brutal in executing the regime's priorities. Müller entered this world not as an agitator, but as a control technician. In 1933, he received promotions in the police for his knowledge of communist activity and his performance, and gradually moved closer to the core Heinrich was forming. Heinrich integrated him into a group of Bavarian recruits who joined the security apparatus, and in 1934 Müller entered the SS, a step that tied him more directly to the police power of the new state. From there, his career ceased to depend on Bavaria and became connected to Berlin, where the center of the regime turned information into a political weapon. There is an important nuance that already reflected the type of man he was. Some later profiles did not agree on the exact timeline of his formal membership and distinguished between affiliations, ranks, and membership in security structures like the SD. In other words, the Müller who rose was not the Nazi by initial conviction, but the policeman who adapted and was absorbed because he functioned. A biographical summary from Yad Vashem placed him in the Munich police headquarters from 1919 and described him as a close collaborator when Heinrich took key positions in 1933, highlighting his value to the leadership based on performance rather than charisma. By the mid-1930s, Müller had already become indispensable. Heinrich promoted him to positions where administrative control mattered: internal coordination, operations management, office discipline, investigation supervision. In 1936, with Heinrich at the head of the Gestapo, Müller acted as chief of operations, a post that involved converting political directives into police procedures. His talent did not lie in inventing ideas, but in executing systems, taking orders, reducing them to forms, and keeping the machine working tirelessly. By the end of the decade, his name circulated in Berlin as one of the most capable administrators of the German political police, a man who had moved from the workshop and the observation plane cockpit to the corridors of police power, and who by 1938 already carried a dangerous reputation: cold efficiency, restrained ambition, and absolute control of information. Head of the Gestapo. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, Heinrich Müller was no longer a desk policeman. He became a central operator of state terror. That same month, with the consolidation of the Gestapo and other police agencies within the new Reich Main Security Office, the RSHA, Müller was appointed head of Amt IV, the section that directed the Gestapo. In practice, this position placed him at the exact point where the regime transformed information into arrests and interrogations into disappearances. The RSHA had unified functions that previously competed with each other: secret police, criminal police, and SS intelligence. From Berlin, this structure coordinated internal surveillance, political persecution, informant networks, repression in occupied territories, and a bureaucracy of files that grew like a living organism. In this organizational chart, the Gestapo, or Amt IV, became the executive arm, the one that knocked on doors at dawn, the one that classified enemies, the one that defined who should be neutralized and with what urgency. Müller directed this machinery like a control technician. His power did not depend on speeches or popularity, but on something colder: mastering the flow of data. In the RSHA, whoever controlled the files controlled destinies. Thousands of officers and agents in regional offices sent reports. Müller received them, cross-checked them, synthesized them, and returned them transformed into orders. His desk filled with names, connections, addresses, and categories. And with categories, a system of repression was built that functioned by procedure, not by exception. The war expanded the Gestapo's reach. When the Reich occupied territories, persecution ceased to be German and became continental. Müller's office supervised investigations against resistance networks, internal opposition, clandestine movements, and any individual whom the Nazi leadership considered a threat. According to the most widely accepted historical summaries, as head of Amt IV, Müller played a key role in detecting and crushing resistance to the regime, and under his direction the Gestapo infiltrated and destroyed opposition groups from social democratic and communist networks to other forms of dissent. This work required constant coordination with other agencies. The Gestapo received information from the SD, the military Abwehr, collaborating police, and German units deployed in occupied countries. Müller did not go into the field. He made the field speak to him via cable, report, or call. In every communication, the method was the same: validate sources, cross-check data, delimit suspects, and order actions. His office became the board on which espionage, treason, and sabotage investigations were assembled, especially when the war began to produce defeats and the regime saw enemies everywhere. Internal tension within the security apparatus also defined his management. Müller respected Heinrich because Heinrich understood the same thing he did. Real power lay in system design, not just in open violence. But his relationship with Himmler was rougher. Himmler valued ideological loyalty and the SS style. Müller embodied something else: bureaucratic discipline, administrative obsession, and a coldness that did not require doctrinal enthusiasm to function. This contrast generated mistrust, but also dependence. They could distrust Müller, but they could not replace what he did without breaking the mechanism. In June 1942, when Heinrich died following the Prague assassination attempt, the RSHA lost its architect, and the machine entered a transition. Müller did not fall with him. He remained in his position and continued operating under Himmler's interim leadership first, and from January 1943 under Ernst Kaltenbrunner. In this new balance, Müller retained practical command of the Gestapo, while the RSHA chief handled general policy and relations with Himmler and Hitler. The question that obsessed historians and prosecutors afterward was always the same: how much autonomy did Müller retain? There is no single answer, but his permanence in Amt IV demonstrated that even with new bosses above him, he remained indispensable for the daily operation of terror. The episode that most exposed this centrality came on July 20th, 1944. That day, a group of officers attempted to kill Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. The assassination attempt failed, and the regime responded with an immediate manhunt. Müller played a key role in the investigation. His office coordinated arrests, interrogations, and the identification of conspirator networks, turning a political crisis into a massive police operation. The Gestapo turned lists into captures and captures into confessions. The goal was not only to punish the guilty, but to dismantle any potentially disloyal environment within the army and the state. Within weeks, the case spread like wildfire and swept thousands along. From that point on, Müller became one of the best-informed men in the Reich. Not necessarily the most formally powerful, but the one who knew too much, who doubted, who conspired, who tried to negotiate, who spoke of defeat, who imagined an end without Hitler. In a system where fear ruled, knowledge was a weapon, and he managed it as he managed everything, without visible emotion, methodically, with papers. By early 1945, Berlin was preparing for the final Soviet assault. The city sank into rubble, and yet the Gestapo continued working. Müller continued to lead his department from the capital while the state collapsed around it. Declassified reports and later intelligence records indicated that his final fate remained uncertain, but some evidence suggested that he may have stayed in Berlin until the end, while portions of his Amt IV withdrew southward near Hof, Salzburg, and Innsbruck. The mystery of his end was fueled by one last image, that of the head of the Gestapo associated with the heart of the dying power. A Reuters report recorded the claim that Müller was last seen in Hitler's bunker in Berlin shortly after the dictator's suicide in 1945. And from that point, history became foggy. Documents, rumors, search lists, escape versions, death versions, unconfirmed burial versions. The only certainty was that the man who had controlled the files of terror ended up entering the same labyrinth of underground corridors where the Reich faded, and after that, no one saw him again with certainty. The last days in the Führerbunker. In April 1945, Berlin became a city that no longer defended a front, but a ruin. The Red Army closed the encirclement, the ministries evacuated what they could, and the official buildings were reduced to corridors filled with dust, smoke, and telephones ringing without any guarantee of a response. In this collapse, Heinrich Müller stayed in the capital. As head of the Gestapo, he believed that his place was alongside the command center, even though that center was no longer a ruling capital, but a bunker managing the downfall. Historical literature places him among the last loyalists who remained in the underground complex while Soviet troops advanced toward the heart of the city. In mid-April, Müller moved to the Führerbunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. He did not arrive as a guest. He arrived as part of the final security mechanism. On the surface, the world was falling apart. Underground, the regime tried to maintain a state routine with maps, war reports, and security rounds. His office was not a solemn office, but a set of administrative rooms attached to the main corridor, narrow spaces where folders, reports, and lists moved as if control still depended on meticulousness. In that setting, his function focused on what he had done all his life: internal security, reading information, evaluating loyalties, and protecting what could not fall into enemy hands. One of the last episodes where his presence is clearly documented was linked to a betrayal that shook the bunker. The news that Himmler had tried to open peace talks with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. At that moment, suspicion shifted toward Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's SS liaison at Hitler's court. The most cited historical account maintained that Müller interrogated Fegelein in the basement of the Trinity Church near the bunker when the matter had already become a political crisis. The scene had a brutal logic. When the Reich was falling, the greatest danger to Hitler was no longer just the external enemy, but internal disintegration. Fegelein was not an ordinary prisoner. He had lived in Hitler's personal entourage and, through family ties, was connected to Eva Braun's circle. During those hours, he was accused of desertion and treason and subjected to interrogations and an improvised trial. Joachim Fest described that a court-martial was interrupted due to the accused's drunkenness, and that the next day Müller interrogated him harshly in the church basement as news arrived about Himmler's betrayal. The sequence ended coherently with the bunker's atmosphere of vengeance. Fegelein was executed, and Hitler expelled Himmler from his positions. The episode revealed something essential. Even at the brink of the end, Müller continued to operate as the guardian of the circle's purity, the man called to turn suspicion into procedure and procedure into punishment. From that point, his daily work resembled a sick routine of normality. Every morning he reviewed intercepted communications, troop reports, Berlin's defense reports, and rumors about internal fractures. His value was not measured by visible rank, but by what he knew: names of clandestine networks, addresses, information channels, and the obedience history of each sector of the apparatus. In a regime built on secrets, Müller understood that secrecy was power and also judgment. What he knew could save him or condemn him if the system fell. That awareness made him more cautious, more secretive, and, according to some witnesses, colder. The bunker survivors remembered that coldness as an almost mechanical trait. They did not describe him as an exalted man, but as someone who maintained composure while everything else fell apart. Rokus Misch, the Führerbunker telephone operator, wrote that seeing Gestapo Müller in the corridor caused him panic, not because of the Soviets or Hitler's fate, but because of the idea that the Gestapo could eliminate those who remained to erase traces and silence mouths. That impression accurately reflected the man's reputation. Wherever Müller appeared, there appeared the sense that no one was safe, not even inside the refuge itself. Traudl Junge also left a mention that made him even more unsettling. The historiographical tradition, which gathered testimonies and sources, placed Junge seeing Müller on April 22nd and added that in practice he assumed some functions that had been Kaltenbrunner's as head of the RSHA, at least within the bunker's microcosm. This statement did not mean a formal appointment, but an emergency reality. With the Reich fragmented, the man who controlled the Gestapo occupied operational space in tasks of security coordination, information, and internal measures. Müller moved through this underground labyrinth in contact with figures who still tried to maintain minimal order. He spoke with the bunker's military commander, Wilhelm Mohnke, because the lines between political security and defense were blurred. He spoke with Martin Bormann because Bormann needed assessments on desertions, leaks, and dangers within the personnel itself. And according to later testimonies, he communicated to Joseph Goebbels concerns about potential opposition networks that could exploit the chaos. The obsession was not just to resist the enemy, it was to prevent the end from turning into a mutiny or an early surrender. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. That day, both Junge and Misch recalled seeing Müller in the bunker. By then, the complex was already functioning as a waiting station without a destination. Some planned to escape, others prepared poisons, others drafted useless orders. The distance between the outside world and underground life became absolute. Those who passed through the corridors described an atmosphere of low voices, hurried steps, and faces no longer sustained by speeches, but by habits. After Hitler's death, the collapse accelerated. On May 1st, the bunker experienced escape attempts, discussions about surrender, and desperate decisions to cross Soviet lines. The last reliable reference to Müller placed him still inside the complex that day. From there, accounts diverged in multiple directions. Some said he went to the Chancellery Gardens, others suggested he moved to adjacent shelters. A few claimed he inspected bodies near an exit. No version was supported by a document placing him outside the bunker after that point, and that absence defined the mystery. In a place where many died, surrendered, or escaped under known names, Müller simply disappeared. The head of the Gestapo, the man who had run the living archive of the Reich's terror, was lost in the final corridors of Berlin's collapse. And from the afternoon of May 1st, 1945, his trace ceased to exist in verifiable terms. The global hunt and theories about his fate. When the war ended in May 1945, Allied intelligence services assumed that Heinrich Müller would appear on any serious list of captured individuals. He was not just any bureaucrat. As head of the Gestapo, he accumulated secrets about counterintelligence, internal repression, networks in occupied Europe, and files capable of compromising hundreds of officials. However, when the Allies counted prisoners in Berlin, Müller was not there. And when the Soviets presented their own lists, his name did not appear clearly either. The disappearance of the Gestapo chief became an immediate problem, because he was not just a fugitive, he was an operational risk. In the following weeks, the search split into two parallel paths. US intelligence, with the Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, taking the lead, conducted searches in hospitals, morgues, detention centers, and improvised records in the destroyed capital. At the same time, the Soviet NKVD carried out its own hunt, but without sharing results. From the beginning, the scenario was confusing. Berlin was full of unidentified corpses, burned documents, swapped uniforms, and witnesses mixing memory with panic. Early indications pointed in opposite directions. Some German prisoners told US investigators that Müller had appeared dead near the Chancellery. Others claimed that Soviet troops captured him and took him out of the city. Nothing could be confirmed. The hunt was complicated by an almost absurd detail. Heinrich Müller was a common name, and the occupiers found several men with the same name in interrogations and post-war lists. The National Archives' historical report on the CIA file admitted that the occupation forces encountered many different Heinrich Müllers, and yet the operational verdict from the counterintelligence war room was categorical. Gestapo Müller had not been located. Even with this lack of certainty, the search did not stop. US counterintelligence followed concrete leads. It received information that Müller had used a false name, Schwarz or Schwarzer, and had attempted to leave Berlin for the south with his radio specialist Christian A. Scholz. They found no verifiable traces. In 1947, the British and Americans raided the house of Anna Schmid, Müller's wartime lover, twice, looking for signs of life, correspondence, or contacts. They also found nothing to prove he was still alive. With the formal start of the Cold War, that absence of evidence became a practical presumption. In Washington, the idea took hold that Müller had probably died in the final chaos of Berlin. But the mystery resurfaced strongly in 1960, when Israel captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. If Eichmann had escaped, then Müller could also have done so. This turn forced the Federal Republic of Germany to reopen lines of investigation. German authorities ordered surveillance of Müller's family in Munich and people linked to his circle, and in 1961 requested cooperation from the occupying forces to expand the observation. In that same investigation, Schmid stated that she had not seen him after April 24, 1945, when he handed her a vial of poison and then disappeared. In parallel, West Germans attempted something more tangible, finding a body. They gathered testimonies and pursued three major leads. The first came from Fritz Leopold, a morgue official who said in 1945 that Müller's body had been transferred from the RSHA area to a municipal cemetery for reburial. Leopold later seemed unreliable, but what was striking was that the grave was recorded and even a tombstone appeared with an inscription declaring him dead in May 1945. The second lead came from Heinz Panwitz, a former subordinate, who recounted that Soviet interrogators told him, "Your boss is dead," and that the body had been found in a tunnel or underground pit near the Chancellery with a gunshot and intact documents. The third version was the most concrete and controversial. Walter Lüders, a member of the Volkssturm, claimed that his burial group found a body wearing an SS general's uniform in the Chancellery garden and that the papers were Müller's. According to him, they buried it in a mass grave in the old Jewish cemetery of Grosse Hamburger Straße, already in the Soviet sector. In 1955, the German Office for Casualty Information WAST even received administrative confirmation that Müller had been buried there in 1945, although the mass grave nature prevented identification of an individual plot. The investigation of the body ran into practical and political limits. In September 1963, authorities exhumed the Lilienthalstrasse grave, and the result was devastating for that hypothesis. The tomb contained the remains of 3 different people, none of them Müller, and the skull belonged to a man roughly 10 years younger. West Germans could not verify either Panwitz's Soviet version or Lüders' account because the presumed burial site of Grosse Hamburger Straße ended up on the other side of the Berlin Wall. To make matters worse, another enigma appeared. WAST returned papers and decorations attributed to Müller to the family in 1958, objects that Lüders claimed to have seen on the body, although neither Leopold nor Lüders mentioned finding medals. No one seriously verified their authenticity. While the West searched for a corpse, intelligence pursued another obsession, the possibility that the Soviets had used him. The National Archives summary on the CIA file described that the agency, in 1970, launched an internal investigation to decide between 2 scenarios: death in Berlin or survival with key files in Soviet hands. The remote trigger was again Eichmann, because his capture revived rumors that had circulated until then as folklore. In 1960, a defector from the Polish intelligence service, whom the report authors identified as almost certainly Michał Goleniewski, provided second-hand information. His Soviet superiors had told him they recruited Gestapo Müller in 1945. Later, the same Goleniewski said he heard that the Soviets picked him up between 1950 and 1952 and took him to Moscow. The CIA tried to trace names associated with this version and found fragments of partial corroboration, though the evidence remained indirect. At this point, the case became intertwined with a typical Cold War phenomenon: disinformation. The CIA, with its counterintelligence staff, concluded that there were strong indications but no proof of collaboration with the KGB and, at the same time, strong indications but no proof that Müller died in Berlin or shortly thereafter. 2 opposing hypotheses, both plausible, neither closed. This ambiguity explained why the file became a kind of internal manual on long investigations that never end. In the 1960s, the mystery degraded into a chain of international rumors: Czechoslovakia, Albania, Turkey, South Africa, and then South America. In 1967, a false sighting produced an almost grotesque episode. Authorities arrested a man in Panama named Francis Keith, suspected of being Müller, and released him when fingerprint checks proved he was not him. The National Archives' historical documentation mentioned the incident, and the press at the time reported how West Germany requested his arrest after receiving photos and a handwriting sample that identified him. The official file, however, ultimately imposed a central idea. A solid trail never appeared. In 2001, the United States published the CIA file on Müller under information release mechanisms, and the National Archives report accompanying this release was categorical on one point. The CIA and its predecessors never knew where Müller was at any point after the war. In other words, the CIA was never in contact with the Gestapo chief.